Welcome to the Ruy Lopez exchange variation. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. These opening moves were first mentioned by Lucena in 1497. The first complete analysis was carried out in 1561 by Ruy Lopez. The Ruy Lopez opening is also known as the Spanish game. That name came after the mid-1800s. The exchange variation of Ruy Lopez, a6, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, is an attempt to avoid some of the complex and abundant theoretical aspects of many of the other variations of the Ruy Lopez. The Ruy Lopez exchange first gained popularity in the late 1800s when Emanuel Lasker started using it. In the 20th century, Bobby Fischer again popularized the exchange variation on the highest level, and Fischer was undefeated in the exchange variation as white. He played 12 games, won 9, and drew 3. White's strategy is to reduce material and transpose into a winning endgame. Let's look at the pawn structure of the exchange variation. First, notice that white has a 4-3 advantage on the king side, and that black has a 4-3 advantage on the queen side. Most importantly, make sure to notice that black's pawns are doubled, so we're talking about the c7 and c6 pawns. That means that in this position, white will win easily because he will be able to convert his 4-3 advantage, and black, because his pawns are doubled on c6 and c7, will not. So we see that white's strategy is very simple: reduce material into a winning endgame. So what is black's strategy? Surprisingly, black must exchange the queens if white decides to play d4, because if he does not, he will have serious problems. For example, castle kingside, f6, d4, e takes d4, knight takes e4, c5, knight b3, and here black will have to play queen takes d1. If black tries to avoid the queen exchange by playing, say, queen e7, attacking the pawn, black will delay the development of his dark squared bishop. If black tries to get fancy and play bishop d7, while white will play knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen h5, g5, queen takes c5, winning the black pawn. Now let's look at what happens when black decides to take with the b pawn. B takes c6. This is not a serious move for a number of reasons. Black's pawns are doubled, just like with the takes c6. But here there are additional weaknesses. Black's a6 pawn is isolated and weak, and black's light squared bishop will be delayed from developing. If he plays bishop b7, for example, c5 will have to be played to open up the diagonal for the bishop. And if black wants to develop along the c8, h3 diagonal, he will have to use another move to play either d6 or d5. So let's go back to d takes c6. Here, white will almost always play castle kingside. This is by far the most popular move. Other moves to consider are knight c3 and d4. d4 was played by Emanuel Lasker against Capablanca in 1914 in St. Petersburg. But super grandmasters almost always play castle kingside. And here black has many different responses. So he can play queen f6, bishop e6, queen e7, bishop e7, bishop d6, bishop g4, queen d6, knight e7, and the main line is f6. Let's start by looking at 5 queen f6 by black. The idea behind this move is that black wants to defend his e5 pawn without blocking his dark square bishop. Play might continue d4, e takes d4, bishop g5, queen d6, and knight takes d4. Because white's queen has been chased around the board a bit, white is slightly better developed in this position. Now let's look at our next move, bishop e6. The move you don't want to play is knight takes e5, because you end up losing the 4-3 pawn advantage on the king side after queen d4, knight f3, queen takes e4, knight c3, queen g6. Instead, what you want to play is d4, and after e takes d4, knight takes e4, here black will have to move his bishop again or lose the bishop pair. Okay, so now let's look at our next move, queen e7. Smyslov made this move popular in the 1970s. The idea is to protect the e-pawn, of course, and black wants to play bishop g4. The overall plan also includes f6, g5, knight h6, and castle long. Play might continue with d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, knight c3, castle long, queen f3, and g6. Now let's look at our next move, bishop e7. With this move, white indirectly defends his e5 pawn. This is one of the few responses from black to which white is not advised to respond with the immediate d4. For example, Christoph Panchik gives the following two lines. So, d4, if white responds with d4, black will play e takes d4, knight takes d4, c5, knight b3, bishop e6, knight c3, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop d6, bishop g5, f6, bishop h4. White's pieces are not doing anything. Black probably has a slight edge in this position. Now let's look at a different move from white on the 7th move. So here white can try queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, c5, knight b3, bishop e6, bishop f4, castle long, and in this position as well, black is perfectly fine and probably has a slight edge. So let's look at white's best response. Which is d3. Now that the e4 pawn is protected, white is threatening to take on e5. It does not make sense to play f6 here for black and block the dark squared bishop off after having just moved it to e7. So black has to play a strange move. Bishop f6. Play might continue knight bd2, bishop e6, b3, knight e7, bishop b2, knight g6, knight c4. Now, three pieces are attacking the e5 pawn, so black has to take. Bishop takes c4, d takes c4. This is a position somewhere between equal and slightly better for white. There's a game between Shaw and Lalich, Hastings 2003-2004 in this position. Let's look at how that game went. Castle kingside, queen takes d8, rook f takes d8, rook f d1, king f8, king f1, king e7, g3, king e6, king e2, rook takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop e7, knight e1, f5, e takes f5 check, king takes f5, knight f3, knight f6, or bishop f6 rather, king e3, h5, h3, knight f4, rook d7. Now, if white plays g takes f4 here, this would be a mistake because e takes f4 is check, and as you can see, the bishop on b2 is under attack from black's own bishop. So say king d2, bishop takes b2. So white plays rook d7, knight takes h3, rook takes c5, rook b8, bishop c3, king e6, and in this position a draw was agreed. But computers think that white has a clear advantage in this position after bishop b4. Now let's look at our next move, which is bishop d6 by black. Bishop d6 goes back to the 19th century. It's a natural move that allows for natural development. But white looks perfectly fine in the positions after bishop d6. For example, play might continue with d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4, f6, bishop e3. Black is allowing white easy development. Position is about equal. So let's look at our next position, next move, which is bishop g4. Bishop g4 is one of the more popular responses from black. This move has been played since the mid-1800s. The idea is to make it difficult for white to play d4. Play will continue with h3, h5. Now if black decides on bishop h5, white will play g4, bishop g6, knight takes e5, queen h4, queen f3, protecting the pawn on h3, f6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, king g2, again protecting the h3 pawn, castle long, d3, bishop d6, rook h1, knight e7. Black has compensation for the pawn with a safer king and connected rooks. Both sides will have a chance to win this one, but computers seem to give a slight half pawn, to be exact, advantage to white. Black will play g5. Let me put the arrow there. Knight g6 and knight g6 and knight f4 to put pressure on h3. So after h5, if white decides to play h takes g4, he will lose the game. So h takes g4, white's knight is attacked, and if he moves the knight, black will play queen h4. So let's say knight takes e5, queen h4, f4, g3. Checkmate on h1 cannot be stopped, but hey, white can stop checkmate on h2 by playing rook e1. Now only queen h1 mates. Alright, so taking the bishop on g4 fails. d3, 7d3. This is white's best move, and here's how play will continue. Queen f6, putting pressure on the pin f3 knight. Knight bd2, adding protection to the f3 knight. Knight e7. The idea is to get the knight to f4. Oops. Rook e1, knight g6, d4. One of the main ideas behind this move is to stop black from playing bishop c5, knight f4, h takes g4. So this is the correct moment to capture that bishop. In a game between Machea and Adams in the 2003 European Club Cup, the game went h takes g4, g3. Note that knight takes e5 loses. Queen h4, f3, g3, king f1, queen h1, checkmate. So white will play g3, g takes f3, queen takes f3, knight e6. Here white will play d takes e5, or in this actual game, white played d takes e5. Queen h6. Black decides to sacrifice the pawn. Knight b3, g5. The idea is to gain the pawn by playing bishop g7, and at some point taking on e5. Bishop e3, queen h3, queen h2, queen h5, f3, bishop g5, the idea previously mentioned. King f2, bishop takes e5, rook h1, queen g6, rook takes h8, bishop takes h8, c3, protecting the b2 pawn from the bishop on h8, castle long, queen h3, bishop g7, queen f5, queen h5, rook g1, b6, knight d2, king b7, rook h2, rook g2, queen h1, rook g1, queen h2 check, rook g2, queen h1, rook g1, queen h2 check. Here the players agreed to a draw. So now let's look at our next move, which is queen d6. Bishop d6 is David Bronstein's idea from 1965, and it has been popular since then. At d6, the queen defends e5, develops his queen, prepares to castle long. Often white will play knight a3, followed by knight c4 to threaten the queen and the pawn on e5. The main line of this variation goes knight a3, bishop e6, prevent knight c4, queen e2, f6, rook d1, c5, c3, bishop g4. Black is doing everything he can to stop the d4 advance, and here black is even willing to trade his light squared bishop. But computers give a slight edge to white in this position, and the database puts white's chances at 38% and black's chances at 20%. Our next move is knight e7. Knight e7 is sharp and theoretical. This is Magnus Carlsen's move. This is Paul Keres's move. Carlsen had 3 games in this variation. He won 2 of them and drew 1 against tough opposition, including Fabiano Caruana. What is the idea? Black wants to play knight g6 when the knight is optimally placed, and effectively provokes white to enter a messy line with tactical play, which is usually not what white is aiming at when playing the exchange variation. The main line goes knight takes e5, queen d4, queen h5, g6, queen g5, bishop g7, knight d3, f5, e5, queen g4. Computers give a slight edge to white after queen e3 here, but in these 97 variations, the more prepared player will be at a huge advantage. Now let's look at the main line of the exchange variation, f6. Immediately we see that by playing f6, black will not be able to develop his knight to the natural f6 square. d4 is the only serious way of continuing. Black will have to decide between bishop g4 and e takes d4. Let's look at bishop g4 first. White will have to decide between playing e takes d5, d takes e5, which transposes into the endgame, or c3, which leads to a complicated middle game. Let's look at c3 first. Fischer played a game against Gligorich in this variation, and the game went e takes d4, c takes d4, queen d7, preparing to castle long, h3, bishop e6, knight c3, developing the knight to its most natural square, castle long, bishop f4, knight e7. Black cannot develop his knight to the natural f6 square because his pawn is there. Rook c1, putting the rook on the only half-open file. Knight g6, attacking the bishop on f4. Bishop g3, bishop d6, knight a4, bishop takes g3, f takes g3, king b8, moving the king outside of the path of the rook on c1, knight c5, king d6, knight a4, king a7 was played, but it should be noted that queen takes h3 loses the bishop on e6 to knight takes e6. So king a7, knight takes a6, a knight sacrifice. Here black played bishop takes h3. If black had played bishop takes a6, white would have played rook takes c6 with an unstoppable attack on a6 and the black king. White even has ideas of rook fc1 to get the other rook into the play. So black played bishop takes h3, white played e5, knight takes e5 was played, but if black Gligorich decided to play f takes e5, the game would have went knight c5 check, king b8. If king b6, white would play queen b4, king a7, and queen takes b7 checkmate. Now, if king b8, white would just simply play rook c3, a rook lift, with many ideas, including rook a3. So black instead played knight takes e5. Fischer played d takes e5, f takes e5, knight c5 check, king b8. And in this position, Fischer played g takes h3, e4, knight takes e4, queen e7, rook c3. The knight on e4 is of course protected by the queen on a4. b5, queen c2, and here Gligorich resigned. Black is already up 2 minor pieces, and now he's cleaning up black's pawns. So this was an amazing game by Fischer, totally dominated Gligorich. So let's look at d takes e5 instead of c3. Fischer played the following game against Rubinetti in this variation. Here, black played queen takes d1. Fischer played rook takes d1, bishop takes f3. Sometimes black will play to double white's f-pawn, as Fischer demonstrates here. That is not so much of a problem for white. For one thing, black has to give up his bishop pair to do so. G takes f3, f takes e5, bishop e3. Here Fischer did not even bother to undouble his pawns by playing f4. Bishop d6, knight d2, knight e7, knight c4, castle long, protecting the dark squared bishop with his rook. Rook d3, getting ready to dominate the d file with his rooks. b5, knight a5, looking for a more active square for the knight. Bishop b4, knight b3, rook takes d3, c takes d3, knight f6, king f1, rook f8, king e2, knight f4 check, bishop takes f4, rook takes f4, rook g1, rook h4, rook takes g7, rook takes h2, a3, making the a5 square safe for the knight. Bishop d6, f4, sacrificing the f-pawn, e takes f4, d4. Now we see two powerful central pawns. King d8, knight a5, c5, e5, bishop f8, knight c6 check, king e8. If king c8, it will lead to rook g8, king d7, d5, king e8, e6, with e7 to follow. So after king e8, Fischer played rook takes c7, and black resigned. The black king is in a hopeless position. If black plays c takes d4, the line will follow e6, d3, king takes d3, rook h3, king e4. No more checks for black. So bishop e7, rook c8 check, bishop d8, rook takes d8, checkmate. Now let's look at e takes d4. Play will continue. Knight takes d4, c5, knight b3, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop g4, f3, bishop e6, bishop f4, with chances for both sides. If we go back, in this position, knight e2, this is the recommended line since it has a winning percentage that is 8% higher for white than knight b3. Play will continue. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop d7, knight bc3, castle long, bishop e3. White's strategy of reducing material and winning the endgame remains. White especially wants to trade one of his minor pieces for one of black's bishops. Rook trades would also help white. Sometimes black will even play rook e8 here. In this position, white will look towards his better development, including having the rooks connected, to find the winning edge.